Dr. Ken Brown, welcome to Women's Wellness Radio.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on your show, Bridget.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dig into this topic. We've had a lot of episodes, but we've never had an episode dedicated to SIBO. So this is perfect. I know it's a condition a lot of women, I see our clients and our readers have, and there's probably more who have it and don't know it. So I think everybody's going to get some benefit from this. So first of all, just tell us a little bit about your background and training and where you work, what you do.
Sure. So as you mentioned, my name is Ken Brown. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist in the Dallas area. Been practicing for the last 15 years, been doing clinical research for the last 10, and I've always had an interest in certain disease processes, which do include irritable bowel syndrome, like functional bowel disease, and inflammatory bowel disease, which happens to be an autoimmune process. So because of all this, I've become much more intrigued about overall gut health affecting these different autoimmune issues like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, and a lot of the stuff that you've been dealing with, like other autoimmune processes that affect a lot of women out there. So my passion is in irritable bowel, which we now know is due to SIBO, bacterial overgrowth.
Oh, okay. So I don't know if I knew that for sure. I guess I thought there was a lot of reasons for IBS. So you think SIBO is always involved with IBS?
So this is, I'm very biased about this because I've been doing a lot of research on irritable bowel syndrome. My problem with IBS is that it is a trash can term, meaning that you have abdominal pain, bloating, and then if you use the restroom and you get better, then you go to a doctor, you do these different tests, and these tests are negative, you will be labeled as having IBS. A great example, I just see people all the time that they go to a doctor, even a gastroenterologist, they'll have an endoscopy, colonoscopy, they'll be waking up from anesthesia, and the doctor will pat them and say, oh, it's just IBS. Well, that just IBS is a very debilitating process to a lot of these people. And saying just something kind of minimizes it. This is where I was about 10 years ago when I was doing clinical research for development of a new drug called Xifaxan, which is now out there right now for IBS-D, which is diarrhea. I was talking to the clinical researcher who was the head person involved with this, and he had discovered that many of the people that were labeled as IBS actually have bacteria growing where it shouldn't be, which is SIBO, bacterial overgrowth. That's when him and I were communicating, and he did mention that, unfortunately, we probably won't be able to help all these people that have bloating, abdominal discomfort, and constipation because of the type of organisms which are causing the constipation. And that's when I had my aha moment where I was working with my research manager and we realized, oh my goodness, it's this type of bacteria that's producing methane that then causes bloating and constipation. So SIBO is IBS-C, and if we can find a natural way to help people, then it would be the panacea, and we could really make a huge difference in everybody's lives.
Okay, I have a question about that too. So IBS-C, IBS-D. I feel like I see people with SIBO who have a lot of loose stool. Or do you not see that?
Oh, all the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's that connection?
Okay, so one of my problems is that when people are labeled as IBS, the doctors quit thinking. So
because it's a syndrome, right?
It's a syndrome. Yeah. Now, here's something. You see a lot of patients, you treat people. Here's something that's very interesting that's always bothered me. You have IBS-C or IBS-D, which is constipation or diarrhea. These are opposing symptoms, and we label it with the same diagnosis. That's always bothered me from day one. So you can't just put a trash can term that covers opposing symptoms. Now, let's back that up. What's happened is with the whole SIBO thing is that we're right where we were 30 years ago with ulcer disease. When we thought ulcer disease was caused by stress and anxiety, then we found out it was due to H.pylori, a bacteria. Same thing's happening with IBS right now. So all these people that have issues, actually what it is that the bacteria is growing where it shouldn't be, called SIBO. So The IBS-C component is if bacteria produces methane. The IBS-D component is if the bacteria produces hydrogen sulfide. So if you produce hydrogen sulfide, you're going to have diarrhea. If you produce methane, you'll have more constipation. And then the mixed people that alternate, because there's a lot of people that alternate, those people actually just, it's the growth, the ebb and flow of the type of bacteria, the type of food that you're eating, and what type of gas that they will actually produce. So SIBO can cause diarrhea and SIBO can cause constipation.
Ah, I love it. Okay, perfect. Because SIBO could be, because you said IBS-C was SIBO, but IBS-D can be SIBO too, just a different type of gas?
It's a different type of gas called hydrogen sulfide.
Okay.
So the way it works for methane is that if you have bacteria producing, so bacteria starts growing where it shouldn't, you eat food, the bacteria produce hydrogen, and then certain types of bacteria called methanogens absorb the hydrogen and through an enzymatic process produce methane. If those bacteria are not dominant, then the other bacteria will take the hydrogen and produce hydrogen sulfide. So we have an example. The bottom line is the beauty of SIBO is that it makes more clinical sense than what we were saying before, which is just, oh, everybody has IBS. Sure, you might have constipation, you might have diarrhea, but you all have IBS. Now I can say, oh, you have IBS because you're producing hydrogen sulfide. You have IBS because you're producing methane.
Okay. So let's talk about the parts of the intestine. We kind of I forgot to say, SIBO stands for small intestine bacterial overgrowth, which, people on the show always think about the small intestine being more absorption and enzymes and that kind of thing. And when you think of constipation and diarrhea, you think of that, I think, coming out of the large intestine, so to speak. So how do these two portions of the intestine interact, and why is SIBO defined as this type in the small intestine?
So for your listeners, let's first describe what exactly SIBO is. And this is the way that I tell my patients. Essentially, you should have a relatively sterile intestine from the stomach almost to the colon. And in the colon, that's where our real microbiome lives. That's where the 100 trillion bacteria live, with over 1,000 species that help us to live better. So if we feed those 100 trillion, we do better. Now, the problem is if somebody goes through a very stressful period, if they take antibiotics, or if they have an infection, then it can actually shock the small intestine, and you go from having a crystal clear stream to a sewer pipe, so to speak, or basically an area where bacteria can start to grow. So that is actually what SIBO is. So then bacteria start growing where they shouldn't. It isn't that bacteria are good or bad, it's that they're just residing where they shouldn't be at the moment. And that's what actually causes SIBO and bacterial overgrowth, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Go
ahead.
I was going to say, our bodies work very hard to keep that area sterile through gastric acid, pancreatic juices, bile, and motility of constantly cleaning that area out. When somebody develops this and it becomes a chronic problem, one of those processes have been kind of altered. Most of the time, it's a motility issue.
Okay, that was going to kind of ask you. So is it oversimplifying it to say, I think there's kind of, you think like the bacteria is moving from the large intestine to the small intestine. Is that not correct? It's more just like the food's coming through, and now because the motility and the juices are not up to snuff, bacteria is starting to grow where it shouldn't have. Is that more accurate?
So I think that it can be a lot of different ways. We're being exposed to bacteria all the time. So your body is constantly being exposed to bacteria. There are some cases where bacteria can go from the colon into the small intestine, but that's going to be what we're calling the distal small intestine, the ileum.
Okay.
The area where the majority of SIBO takes place is in the upper small intestine, called the duodenum.
Okay.
And that's where it grows. So the current thought process is that you probably have migration of colonic stool into the small bowel a lot. But this particular type of thing that we're talking about is that you're taking in bacteria. We're always exposed to it, and bacteria can start to grow because there's a little area that's been walled off or the motility changes. So it's much higher up than from the colon. So I don't necessarily believe, there are cases where you have what's called ileal backwash, where colonic bacteria goes into the ileum, but that's the distal small bowel. I'm talking a little bit higher up, like just past the stomach in the duodenal sweep. That's what throws everybody off. That should be sterile. It's not. And it's what really kind of ruins everybody's lives, because after they eat, the bacteria break down the food before you can, and then you get really bloated. And that's what really messes everyone up.
This is brand new to me. I'm really excited to learn it. I guess because I heard, that valve between small intestine is sometimes lax. I thought, I guess the bacteria is just coming up. I did not realize it was this way.
There's probably a certain amount of that, but the fact is it's got to come up about 20 feet. There's lots of small bowel in there. It's a whole lot easier if the intestines don't move. I mean, you take in billions of bacteria every single day, even if you're not eating a lot of cultured foods and stuff. We just take it in because nothing is quite sterile. So if it has the ability to hang out in a little pool party, so to speak, they'll start growing and multiplying and then become more chronic.
And they'll make little pockets, it sounds like, a little protected area.
Well, so what ends up happening is that the bacteria starts to grow. So one of these events happens. Let me give you a very common scenario of somebody that will come to see me. They will go to Mexico on vacation and they'll get Montezuma's revenge. And they'll say, man, 5 years ago, I got really sick in Mexico. I've never been right since. And those are the people that used to be called post-infectious IBS. Now I say, oh, wow, that is classic for bacterial overgrowth. You had an infection, and now you have an area of your intestines that doesn't move well. Think of it like this. You've got two power lines which are passing the electrical current between the two. If these two power lines are dysfunctional, then that area between the two, that of the small bowel, it doesn't move very well. So you eat food filled with bacteria and your body's breaking it down, it's moving it, and then there's a little area there where the food just kind of sits and allows everything to ferment, bacteria start to grow, and then once that bacteria starts growing, they kind of make their own little factory. Methane, for instance, is a local paralytic, meaning it slows everything down in that area. So once you start producing methane, you go from having a little cesspool or a little sewer pipe, and then more bacteria starts to grow. More methane's produced, and now you have a bigger sewer pipe. So now we have the chronic thing that's going on, and this is why people can suffer for years with this.
They can. Yeah, I have met people on a restrictive diet for like 12 years.
Yeah, that's way too long.
I'm like, something's not right. You shouldn't have to do that for so long. Okay, so I want to just understand. So that first little bit of poor motility that you mentioned before they go to Mexico, did that come from a different exposure to bacteria or stress, or like what was that? Is it the little bit of lack of motility that is the first sort of weak link, would you say?
I think it really kind of all does come down to motility, and it's whatever affects the motility of the intestines.
Okay.
So in the case of the person that went to Mexico, they go to Mexico and they get a bad infection. That bad infection either shocks the intestines, or you can actually produce antibodies to those power lines that I was describing due to the infection.
Okay.
Which is, we can discuss that in a second.
Okay.
But if you have a stressful experience, the fight or flight kind of phenomenon. So I have a lot of people that'll go, man, I had a divorce 3 years ago and I've been very ill ever since. And so when I talk to them, it's because they went through a very stressful period. With the work that you've done, that can affect hormones, that can do all different kinds of things. But really, the sympathetic response changes the motility of the intestines. And then people get sick and with something else, and they go and they get antibiotics. The antibiotics we now know really kind of affect them, the whole microbiome also. So I get a lot of people that were on doxycycline for acne for a few years. And then after they got off, it was they just had horrible IBS, and they come to me with this IBS, and I say, no, I don't think it's IBS. I think it's bacterial overgrowth due to the antibiotics that you've been on for a long time.
Okay. So it sounds like there are different things that can slow down the motility, like emotional shock, kind of like a bacterial shock to the system. And is slowing down the motility in a way like a beneficial thing in theory at first, but then it just goes on, or am I oversimplifying that?
Well, I will take it a little bit deeper here, if you don't mind. If I'll just talk a little bit about the science, about what's actually going on.
Okay.
So when somebody affects the motility of the intestines, what we have learned is that they lose, and all these other reasons can cause this thing that I'm going to basically describe, which is when we go to sleep, and you know very well that sleep hygiene is extremely important for all health, but including the gut. When we go to sleep in a normal individual, you have what's called a phase 3 contraction, or the migrating motor complex. It's also known as the housekeeper phenomenon. So while you're in deep sleep, every 60 to 90 minutes, you have this very violent, propulsive movement of your intestines. And it does that to prevent these kind of things from happening. It moves everything into the colon. So if any bacteria happens to be growing anywhere, it just moves it on down the line and does this. When people have this problem, they lose that ability. So we know that when they go to bed at night, an area of their intestines doesn't move or doesn't have that phase 3 contraction. So bacteria start to grow. So and these little cell towers, they're called the interstitial cells of Cajal. So it's cell tower Cajal to cell tower Cajal. Those things are knocked down. We're in hurricane season right now, unfortunately, and we're seeing everything being knocked down in the Caribbean and Houston and Florida. And essentially that's what happens. You lose the ability to communicate in that one area. So bacteria can start to grow. And they wake up every day, they feel great, they eat some food, and then they bloat like crazy because the bacteria want to start eating that right off the bat. Okay.
Thank you for indulging me as I try to understand all this.
Tell me if I'm geeking out too much. As you can tell, I like this is my space. So, but I think
it's great.
I have honestly found that when patients can at least make a little sense of it, even if I can't help them, if they can just make sense of it and go, oh, I get it now. I'm not crazy. I don't just have IBS. I have a motility issue, allowing bacteria to grow, and then when I eat, it causes these symptoms. That makes sense. And just the ability to understand it helps a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I was missing these pieces. I was like, okay, the digestive system is just so complex. And I was definitely missing the piece on how exactly the SIBO was developing. Like, I think I had filled in some blanks on my own that weren't correct. So it's really interesting. So I have a question for you, because I know I talked to a colleague recently, and he was saying, and you may disagree, that they're finding that SIBO is always an autoimmune disease. Do you agree or disagree with that one?
Love that you brought that up. It's not always an autoimmune disease, but a percentage of people with SIBO, it is an autoimmune disease.
Okay.
And that's like that's the highest, that's a very broad term of it, because then I'll take it one step deeper here in a second. So when I mentioned that if you go to, I shouldn't pick on Mexico, if you go any place and get sick, if you get Campylobacter, Salmonella, Shigella, very common infections, our bodies are built to take in the outside world and to grab nutrients. If you think how complex the intestines are, they grab nutrients, absorb what we need, but then also keep out what shouldn't be in your body. Well, one of the things that it shouldn't be would be a bacterial attack from something that is going to make you sick. So what happens is you have these security guards that are called dendritic cells. They reach up, they sample what's there that seems to be disrupting everything, and they hand it off to another cell in our autoimmune system called a B cell. And the B cell looks at this and says, that is Campylobacter. We need to get rid of it. It's going to make us really sick. So it hands it off, and they produce antibodies to it. Now, antibodies are the soldiers that go around and they kill the infections in our body. That's why we can develop antibodies to a virus, and you're then immune to it. And that's why we give vaccinations and such. So these antibodies go around and they get rid of the bacteria. Unfortunately, those cells that I was talking about, those power lines, the cells of Cajal, they actually are very similar to the toxins produced by bacteria. So these antibodies kill the bacteria, and then in around 20% of the people, they kill those power lines as well. Mm-hmm. So it ends up being an autoimmune disease that way.
Oh, that's so interesting.
So 20% of the people will have that. Now, what your colleague may have been describing is something that I'm very passionate about, which gets a little bit deeper than that, which is the autoimmune process is shutting down the electrical current, but we now know that the inflammatory process that goes on results in some intestinal permeability or leaky gut. Now, leaky gut, we're learning, causes autoimmune disease. So probably it was a little bit of the both. It's one, that there's antibodies that you can check for, and two, that if you leave it if SIBO goes unregulated, then you can develop autoimmune disease because it causes leaky gut.
Okay. What is the antibody called? That, because people probably want to know.
And you can actually check for this, but remember, it's only in about 20% of the people. So I check it occasionally in people, but if they have classic symptoms, this just tells me if it's positive that we're going to battle a little bit with recurrence. It's called the vinculin antibody, VINCULIN, or the CDT antibody. That's the cytolethal distending toxin, CDT. So CDT and vinculin are the two antibodies that we can check now. And there's a couple, I think most of the lab companies now are actually checking for those if you ask for it.
Oh, cool. That's so awesome. Okay. Well, luckily, I understand this part a little better, so you don't have to explain it all to me. So similar to what we all hear about with Hashimoto's, how the cells of the thyroid look like other things.
Exactly. So that's one of the things that I run into, is that I get a lot of people that started with, let's call it IBS, and then develop thyroid disease, and then show up with celiac disease later, or they show up with Crohn's. Is that bad luck? Or is it that your immune system is just revved up and ready to attack anything? I think that's the future of where we're headed with this. That once you're inflamed, your body is willing to attack. Your immune system's overreacting is what it comes down to.
Okay. So you mentioned H.pylori earlier, and I wondered how often you see H.pylori together with SIBO.
Okay, so H.pylori is something that we discovered like 30 years ago. We do know that it can cause ulcers, and we do know that it's a class 1 carcinogen, meaning in certain populations it can cause cancer. Certain cultures, like in India, I think around 80% of all the people are positive for H.pylori. Certain professions like gastroenterologists, I think I saw a quote, like 100% of all gastroenterologists are positive for H.pylori. H.pylori, once it was discovered, started to get blamed for everything. So the incidence of H.pylori in SIBO, I don't think that there's a correlation at all. I don't see it. Whenever I do endoscopies in people, I'll biopsy the small bowel, I'll treat everything. What we do know is that treating H.pylori can make some SIBO people better because you're giving them antibiotics. What I'm getting at with the whole, every gastroenterologist has H.pylori and 80% of all people living in India have it, is that we're probably blaming it for too much.
Okay.
We discovered it 30 years ago, and now that we have the DNA on it, they have looked at exhumed bodies, and they have found H.pylori in 500-year-old bodies and so on. So that is, in my field, that's a little bit of a moving target where you'll have these experts hotly debate several aspects. Once we started to get rid of H. pylori, the incidence of esophageal cancer has gone up 700%. So,
interesting.
So H. pylori is really common to the general public. As gastroenterologists, we're really wondering if we did something wrong by trying to eradicate all the H. pylori. That's a very hot button issue for
we'll have
people
you back on to talk about that one. You know what?
Yeah, that's pretty much its own show right there.
Yeah, I was a little curious because you were saying how we used to blame it on stress, the ulcers, and then so there's just like I just realized. So I had an ulcer when I was in junior high because I had symptoms. I don't even remember what they were, burning or something, and they're like, yeah, it's probably due to stress, and here's some like proton pump inhibitors or whatever, and then I kind of forgot about it. But then it was found again when I was an adult, and we treated it.
The H. pylori was found?
The H. pylori, yeah, because they weren't looking for it back then, I guess. And when I treated it, it didn't make any difference in my digestion. So yeah, that is a whole other issue, but it just kind of got my head thinking, okay, was that H. pylori working against me all this time, or maybe it really wasn't. It did seem to give me symptoms, maybe, if I had, back then I did have symptoms. But when I did finally get rid of it, it didn't really.
And it could certainly cause ulcers in a small percentage of people. Once you find an ulcer, you have to treat it. And
I guess, too, because you said, like, the reasons why this SIBO can happen, one was, like, lack of gastric acid, which H. pylori can contribute to, right?
Correct. Yeah, H. pylori can lead to what's called an atrophic gastritis, which means that it basically burns out your acid-producing cells. So that's another thing that H. pylori can do.
Okay.
So I'm not saying H. pylori is good. I just think that we're maybe over-treating it because we're putting people on 2 weeks of really tough antibiotic regimens.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is this. I will not, unless I have an ulcer, I'm not going to check myself for H. pylori because I don't want to do the antibiotics, and I'll just, we'll just kind of ride with it until I have symptoms. So that's what I tell my patients. I don't particularly want to draw a blood test on you because you're not having symptoms from it. If you're having symptoms, let's look for it. If we find it, we have to treat it. A lot of primary care doctors are checking blood tests. And if you're positive, then they'll put you on this tough antibiotic regimen. And it's certainly what the literature recommends that we do right now for patient safety, but I don't really know if it's the best thing to be doing.
Yeah, it's really strong, and then we're damaging our gut with the
Exactly.
Okay. So we mentioned earlier that probably you and I both know people who've stayed on a special diet for like a decade because they have SIBO. I met one health coach, and she was like, well, that's the thing. That's the treatment. You do this diet forever. And so I guess I'll just ask you, can SIBO be treated with diet alone?
Diet alone can certainly make people with SIBO feel better while they're on the diet. And so the different diets that are out there, we'll start with gluten-free, which is probably the most common. And then you move to other diets like the FODMAP diet, which are tough to digest sugars and starches. And then there's the SCD diet, and then the elemental diet, and the list goes on to just the ketone diet, the starvation diet, all these other things. But they all have one thing in common. Bacteria love starches. So when you don't give them starches, they go dormant. Dr. Mark Pimentel, that came up with the original concept of SIBO, and that was the person I was doing research with to develop or to help him with Xifaxan. He's the one that had really pointed out, even through animal models, that you can starve the bacteria, but the bacteria are extremely resilient. If you still have that area that isn't moving real well, they'll go into a dormant state, and they'll just wait for the right food that they want. Which is why when you look at the data on the two most common diets, FODMAP diet and gluten-free diet, the beneficial results are around 28%. Problem is, when you start eating normal again, your symptoms come back. So when you mentioned that you have friends that have been on a certain restrictive diet for 12 years, because every time they tried to get off of it, the bacteria wake up and go, oh, look, we got bread again. We got pasta. This is awesome. Then they nudge their buddy and say, wake up, it's time to start eating again. And then you have bacteria grow again. So what I do with my patients is I like to put them on a mildly restrictive diet. I think that the data has shown that gluten-free is probably equivalent to SCD or FODMAP or these other ones, at least in the short term. I'm not a big fan of gluten the way that we have it here in the Western Hemisphere. So I really like them to try and go gluten-free. And then we treat the bacterial overgrowth, and they can start reintroducing some of these foods back in after we treat it. So most of the literature shows that 28% of the people will feel better on the diet, but most likely it'll come back once you start expanding your diet again.
Okay. So $1 million question is, how do you treat it?
Well, I'm a little bit biased on how I treat it. So one of the things is that I actually do have a natural product that I developed specifically for bloating and SIBO type symptoms called Atrantil. So I prefer to treat things in a natural way. Atrantil is certainly one way that the majority of the people that come see me have at least tried it. That is a combination of 3 different natural ingredients that get rid of the bacteria, and then they feed your normal colonic bacteria because it's made up of polyphenols. That's one way. The other way that the IBS-D, the FDA has approved a minimally absorbed antibiotic called Xifaxan. Xifaxan was shown in 2 clinical studies to be roughly about 10% better than placebo, or about a 40% response rate. The other treatments which are available are herbal antibiotics. Shockingly, herbal antibiotics, and that includes like allicin, berberine, golden seal. And, I've met a lot of really great naturopathic doctors that have their own little regimen, but they all do the same thing. They all use polyphenol type natural products that work to get rid of bacteria. Herbal antibiotics were actually shown to be equivalent and slightly superior to Xifaxan in a couple small studies, which is a little bit annoying to me that those particular studies didn't make it into bigger journals, which kind of shows the bias of big pharma versus natural. And then we get into some slightly more controversial things, which would be probiotics. Everybody loves probiotics. The jury's still out on probiotics for this because some people do get better. A lot of people that see me get worse on it. That's the problem, because they take probiotics and you're basically adding fuel to the fire, so to speak. And then finally, there's a few other random things like low dose naltrexone that some of your listeners may have heard of and things like that. But you were going to say something about the probiotics?
Oh, I'm just wondering, okay, so which type of bacteria is this in the SIBO cases?
So the type of bacteria, what we do know is that if you're producing methane, and we can show that it's methane, you're going to have a type of bacteria called an Archaeobacter, which is in its own kingdom. So you have fungi, Archaeobacter, and then the normal type of bacteria that we always talk about. The reason why the Archaeobacter is different is because it's a methanogen. And the one that they have really figured out that happens is called Methanobrevibacter smithii, M. smithii. So we've got that one nailed down. So if you're producing methane, most likely you've got this little guy named M. smithii growing where it shouldn't be, which is in the small bowel. We do have M. smithii in our colon. And then the other types of bacteria, they really haven't isolated it because there's a lot of different kinds that can actually grow and produce either hydrogen or hydrogen sulfide. So that list is much broader and much longer. Those bacteria tend to respond to modern day antibiotics, which is why Xifaxan got approved to treat diarrhea. So bacteria that produce hydrogen sulfide are a little easier to get rid of than that little critter named M. smithii, which is a little harder to get rid of.
Okay, so supposedly some probiotics could feed maybe these hydrogen sulfide producers.
Yeah, so the probiotic discussion is really difficult to get into because there's been some practitioners will say I've had tremendous success with it, There is a researcher out of Houston. His name is Eamon Quigley, and he is the godfather of probiotics. He was talking probiotics 40 years ago. He was a professor. He's from Scotland. He's a professor at these different institutions, like very, very prestigious. And I bumped into him at a meeting and I said, Eamon, let's talk about this for a second. You've been studying these probiotics for 40 years. The data in gastroenterology shows that all the studies demonstrate that they're about equivalent to placebo. So you have these probiotics that everybody loves, but when you put them in humans and you do a study on them, after 6 months, it's about the same as a sugar pill. And he summed it up best for me. He goes, look, in a petri dish, in vitro, they do amazing things. We just can't quite get them to do what we want in humans by giving one type of probiotic, one type of bacteria, 20 million, 20 billion, whatever it is. It's the equivalent of turning on a faucet and you have water. You go, oh, I love water. Let's bring in a bunch of plumbers. So instead of bringing in electricians and framers and roofers, you like water, so you bring in 20 billion plumbers, which is kind of what we're doing with the probiotics. We're trying to give a lot of one thing and hoping that it works. So if probiotics help you, awesome. If they don't, well, it kind of makes sense why they wouldn't. So
okay. Yeah, we have a microbiologist who has been on the show a few times, and so we know our community's learned a lot about how stomach acid can kill probiotics and this kind of a thing, and they're not all created equal. So yeah, we can we can put a pin in that one too.
Yeah, that's a whole nother show right there.
Yeah, I know some probiotics say they're SIBO safe. There's one company I work with that does something like that. So tell us more about this product you developed, the Atrantil, and I think if I got this correct, it has a little more emphasis on the methane producing. Oh wait, M.Smithii.
M.Smithii, nice.
I'm learning, but it could potentially have some benefit as well for the other class. Is that right?
Yeah, so we developed this basically because there was no answer for anybody that was actually bloated with constipation that's producing methane. And since I mentioned that the M.Smithii, the Archaeobacter, is a very primitive organism, modern day antibiotics don't work on it. That's when me and my research manager, she comes from a very unique background where she was a policy writer for a senator in Iowa, and they were trying to mandate farmers in Iowa add food products to cattle to decrease methane production for the greenhouse effect.
Oh.
And that's when we started looking at the literature and we went, wow, it's already been done for us. They've been trying to decrease methane in cattle. So that's how we set out to develop Atrantil. It has 3 ingredients. One of them is embalsamate, which is peppermint leaf, not the oil, because the leaf is a true polyphenol. Then conker tree, and then quebracho colorado. So I've been approached by quite a few people who have a background in herbs and such, and they've never seen this before. And the reason is because it's never been put in a supplement for humans, but we eat it all the time. What we figured out through all the data with the animal models is that those 3 ingredients together work synergistically to get rid of the bacteria. And it does it like this. The embalsamate calms everything down. The quebracho colorado is the workhorse. It's a very large polyphenol. And I keep using the word polyphenol. These are just the molecules in the skins of vegetables, and they're very high in the Mediterranean diet. So this is the thing that we know is probably very good for us. You're going to hear a lot more about this in the next few years. And then the quebracho is a very large polyphenol that it does 2 things. It soaks up all the gas being produced by the other bacteria, and it has a natural affinity and a natural defense against Archaeobacter, M.Smithii. Third ingredient, the conker tree, comes in and it kills bacteria also, but what it's there for is it actually blocks the enzyme that the M.Smithii uses to produce the methane. So Atrantil it calms everything down, it weakens the Archaeobacter, and it stops methane production. And that's why we put those 3 ingredients together.
So let me ask you this. So if you get rid of this bacteria, and I think you said it does some things to feed friendly bacteria too. Did you say that?
Correct. So,
Okay.
mhm.
Okay. So you're taking care of that aspect. Does the motility come back, or do you have to do something different for that?
That's a great question. So we do have different subsets of people. We have certain people that take it. In my original studies that we did, we've got 2 published studies. One is a randomized trial. One is people that have failed everything else. Most of the people that took it took Atrantil, they got better, and then they just took it as needed whenever they would eat any foods that would bother them.
Okay.
Then there was a small subset of people, which is where we're going to get into that autoimmune aspect that we talked about earlier, where if they have those antibodies, the vinculin antibody and the CDT antibody, they're going to be at risk of always having a motility issue. So we treat them cyclically, and you can do that with Atrantil or antibiotics or herbal things. So the motility should get better because you've gotten rid of the methane, which is the local paralytic. In the 20% of the people that have those antibodies, a little bit tougher, and we got to try and keep that thing moving. And I actually do that by adding a pro-motility agent when they go to sleep.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And that's a prescription?
I used to use something called Zelnorm, which was taken off the market, which was really good. And so then I moved to erythromycin, but I'm also finding natural ways to do it. Iberogast is one, and some of my patients have had success with Motil Pro, which is another natural product that you can take. So I'm dabbling with those other natural things as well to do that.
Okay, interesting. My assistant's going to have fun all these names correct for all these things. But we will hash it out. So if you're like, what was that thing he said? You just go to the notes and we'll have it all there. So this product that you developed, it's herbal. But how is it sold? Is it only through practitioners, that kind of a thing?
No, it's sold. It's sold online. You can go to lovemytummy.com.
Okay.
It's there. And then, Amazon, and we do have a lot of practitioners. We are in a few retail, I should say a few. I think we're in about 2,000 retail locations right now.
Oh, wow.
But mostly we're really trying to handpick our retail people, people that really understand it. Because, as you can tell by this podcast, this is a very complex topic. So we want to make sure that the people that carry it really understand that and that they're helping people. So I do want to comment really quick about the polyphenol aspect of it. The reason why this is super cool, and this is kind of an after the fact type thing. What happens is when these molecules get rid of the bacteria, and all they do is just make it so that the bacteria go back to where they should, which is the colon. That's where your microbiome should live. I always joke around that there's, if you see a pregnant woman, she's eating for 2, but really all of us should be eating for 100 trillion, because we should be feeding our colonic bacteria what they really want. So if you give your bacteria what they want, they will give you what you need. And these polyphenols go into the colon, they get broken down by the bacteria, and then they actually have molecules that we're learning more and more about that are very, very beneficial for you. An example about this, if any of your listeners want to look this up, this is really cool. There's a tannin called an epigalic tannin that if you eat certain foods, that tannin goes into your colon where your bacteria will break it down and produce a molecule called urolithin. That urolithin tells certain mitochondria that are aging to go away. So what I'm saying is we age as humans because our cells age. Our cells age because the mitochondria get old, the little powerhouses. So you can actually feed your colonic bacteria anti-aging stuff, which is polyphenols. And those polyphenols tell the aging mitochondria to just go away. And that is one of the ways that we can help ourselves. That's why the Mediterranean diet is an anti-aging diet. We're learning the molecules now. We can break it down to the chemistry of it. It's super, super exciting.
Yeah, it all circles back to eat plants and fruits.
I mean, it's so funny because you cannot outdo Mother Nature. if you do it right and you eat a lot of diverse plants, a lot of colorful plants, your body will do well. And all health begins and ends in the gut. So it's just hard to do in one of the most developed countries in the world. Here in the United States, it's almost like you have to take some of these things if you're going to eat a regular diet, because we manipulate our crops so much. We do so many things, the refined foods, all these exposures to toxins. I think that they recently, one of the last there was a study that just got published, one of the last hunter-gatherer tribes in Africa, they analyzed their stool and they have some of the most diverse microbiome of anybody they've ever analyzed. And these are people that are just, they didn't have crops. They're literally hunter-gatherers. They kill and eat what they can get their hands on, and they've got great microbiome. And granted, they deal with a few other things that we don't have to here, but.
Yeah. I mean, it is. It's almost, it's hard to get that original of a diet in our culture and with traveling, and we'll blame Mexico again. I'm just kidding. But we do. We travel. We expose ourselves to new things. We expose ourselves to stress or antibiotics sometimes. So, a lot of my clients, Ken, I'm sure you see this too, they've really cleaned up their diet already, but they're still having bloating or whatnot. And it's like, well, yeah, you've really cleaned it up. That's fabulous. Probably some things have gotten better, but there was damage done, earlier that hasn't been fixed yet. So we either stay on this super restrictive diet, which I see many people trying to do, or we get in and, use these herbs, use these polyphenols to really fix it so we can get back to a more enjoyable, diverse diet again.
Absolutely. I was recently in Spain not too long ago, and I was just shocked. I was walking around the street. I was in Barcelona, and I'm looking around, and I don't know if you've been over there recently, but I was shocked at how many people still smoke. A lot of people smoked, and what they would eat. So I'm gluten intolerant, and I can only eat gluten if I take Atrantil. If I don't have it, I get really, really sick. And so I was shocked. I was able to eat bread there and eat pasta there. And, you really start wondering about what we're doing with our food here. And why can you go to Europe? And I have so many patients go to Italy and they eat pasta, and here they can't have pasta at all. So it just got me thinking. I'm like, this is crazy. Everybody wants to say, it's due to stress. So they lead a much more relaxed lifestyle. They walk a lot. So I was trying to piece it together, and I looked, and I looked at the polyphenol consumption of a typical Spaniard and a typical American, and it's like 10 times as much in Spain. 10 times as much.
Interesting.
And I woke up every morning. I just had a blast. I'd walk down the streets. I'd go to a coffee shop. I'd get, they eat cured meat and cheese with bread, for breakfast. And it was awesome. And I'd bring it back to the family and everything. And I'm like, I would never do this in the US. I would never just go out and eat a sandwich for breakfast because I get sick.
Yeah.
So it just got me thinking that I think that we're doing something to the food, whether it's the glyphosate, whether it's the refined sugars. I think a lot of people can argue a lot of different things, but
and the strain of wheat too.
Yeah.
Or how we store it and that kind of thing. So there are options. I gotta study these polyphenols more. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with that. I'm meeting a lot of really cool scientists, and in this field, you start meeting one person that's doing research on something, and they've got this little piece of the puzzle, and then this person has this little piece, and that's actually how we developed Atrantil. We looked at this literature that had this little piece, and this one that had this little piece. So
yeah,
it's a wide open field. I think that we can develop something to protect. If you live in the United States, maybe there's something that we can come up with to sort of offset all these issues.
You came up with one of them.
Well, I came up with one of them. And all we did is knock down a bunch of doors where it just opened our eyes to a bunch of other things. And now I've got PhDs from all over the world calling me up saying, I'm doing this research. Is there any way that I can help you?
That's so cool.
Super, super
So
exciting.
cool.
Yeah.
Well, Ken, I have to hop on another interview, actually. So
Okay.
I'm going to close this up, but we will share all your links, and maybe we'll start carrying your product in our store at some point. If we're
Absolutely.
allowed. That'd be
Absolutely.
fun. So yeah,
So-
so great to meet you, and we really appreciate all your research and what you've created.
Bridget, thank you so much for having me on your show. It was fun.